Hi, I'm Conrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, a magazine for your ears featuring in-depth conversations with fascinating people from sport and politics, science and culture, business and beyond. Every week you can download new episodes in which top journalists from across our newsrooms talk to compelling people about the definitive stories of the day. In this episode, we speak to Gina Chick. The winner of Australia's first alone TV series, Chick has long done things in her own unconventional way. In the show itself, she chatted to platypuses, had big talks to a lake, and apologised to a wallaby before eating it. She joins us today to talk a little bit more about how her affinity with nature came to chime with the times. We recently featured her on the cover of Good Weekend, under the headline Cool Chick, from shunned outsider to charismatic celebrity. And hosting this conversation is the journalist behind that piece, award-winning freelance writer David Lacer.
Gina, welcome.
Thank you.
Australia got to know you as the winner of the first Alone Australia series on SBS, broadcast last year. Why on earth did you go on that show?
That's a really good question. It's funny. I think people are bewildered by anybody wanting to go on that show, whereas for me, it felt like a choiceless choice. Once I realised that there was an opportunity to apply, there was absolutely no question that I was, not going to take it up. And I wanted to test my skills, test the skills that I'd been, practicing and teaching for very many years, how to be at home in the wilderness and how to be at home in the wild. But I also wanted to make a stand for something that I think we don't really get to see in our culture, which is a way of living in harmony with wilderness rather than fighting nature. And so to be able to go out there and tell that story was really important to me.
So for those of our listeners who didn't see you win Alone Australia, what unforgiving part of this continent were you deposited in, and what were you expected to do? What did you take with you? First of all, where did they put you?
The premise of Alone is that 10 people of dubious sanity get dropped into some absolutely godforsaken wilderness in the middle of winter to survive as long as possible with 10 basic survival items that they can choose from a very short list. And the last person standing wins.
Oh my God.
Who wants to sit out there cold and miserable the longest? Congratulations, you win.
How you going?
Now, I was dropped into southwestern Tasmania in the Tarkine region, which has a rainfall of, I think it's 2.5 metres a year, 255 days a year. I reckon most of them were when I was out there. And it is cold, it is wet, it is muddy, it is inhospitable, and I needed to survive as long as possible, solving the challenges of shelter, water, fire and food.
I mean, you obviously felt confident enough. You saw that this reality TV show that had been going for 9 seasons in North America in some pretty wild places, Mongolia and Alaska, I think,
and Arctic Circle.
Yeah, and Patagonia. So they'd been in some pretty forbidding places. You saw that you had an opportunity here to redefine or tell a different story about how we might be able to live in harmony with nature. But there must have been a core confidence that you had that you could do this.
Yes.
Where did that come from?
Well, I have been teaching people how to be at home in the wild for probably 15 years. And before that, I've spent my whole life learning to be at home in the wild myself. Now, I'm not a survival expert. I will never say I am. But I do have the skills of how to make a fire in pretty much all conditions, how to make a shelter that will work and keep me warm and dry, basic fishing. I can look after myself enough when I'm in a survival setting. But also I have sort of been to the bottom of the pit internally and looked at everything inside me so that I'm not afraid of anything that might come up when I'm alone. And the thing is with these survival challenges, to be completely on your own For a lot of people with this show, it's the first time they've ever done it. And because we live in a society that sort of pathologizes discomfort, we have so many distractions available to us. So we never really get to feel uncomfortable. There's always something to do. There's something to grab. There's a phone or there's a TV or, there's some food. And because of that, we don't develop the skills of being able to process our own deep emotions. Now, I've spent my whole life doing just that. So I knew that when I went out on this survival challenge, I wasn't going to get driven out by solitude, which I think is actually the thing that most people find the hardest.
One of the reasons we're talking today is that your book, your memoir, your exquisite memoir, We Are the Stars, has just been published. And I wrote a story for Good Weekend on you and aspects of that book. And one of the things that you reveal in that book is about that aloneness that you had. I mean, the acid pain of rejection, your words, that you had suffered from as a child. Tell us a little more about that. Why were you rebuffed by your peers as a little girl?
I was a very, very strange kid. And I grew up in a family where I didn't know I was a strange kid. So I was completely loved and cherished, and all of my strangeness was celebrated when I was at home. But then when I would go out into the wider world, I would run into this wall of bewilderment and judgment at the way I was, and I didn't know why. And so I was just like a puppy that would just bounce up to people in all my strangeness and then wonder why they kicked the puppy. Now I look back and I can see why. I was doing things like I'd rescue birds and that had fallen out of their nests, or people would bring them to me and I would feed them like a mother bird would. So I'd chew up seed and I'd spit it into their mouths because that just made sense. And then I would take these birds to school, and at lunchtime, in front of the other kids, I'd chew up birdseed and spit it into a bird's mouth. Now, this is not something you do in an Aussie school. This is not going to win you friends and make you popular. And so the kids would be going, "Oh, Gina's kissing a bird. She's vomiting in its mouth. Oh, you weirdo, you freak." And yeah, I would climb the tree to talk to the magpies. I would tell people I understood what the wind was saying. I was just odd.
Did you do more of that because you felt the sting of rejection? I mean, did you feed birds from your mouth because nobody else was talking to you and this was something to do?
No. I fed birds from my mouth because it made sense. My first connection was with nature, always, and my family. And so I just didn't care what other people thought of me enough to change my behaviour. So even though I would get bullied and I would, be rejected for spitting seed into birds' mouths, there's no way I was going to stop because it was the best way to feed a bird. And if I went up and I bounced up to someone and talked to them for an hour and a half about the feeding habits of galahs or, New Holland honeyeaters, and they all ran away, I wouldn't think not to do that again because they're fascinating. This is fascinating stuff that I'm imparting. No, it's just weird.
And they called you the bird girl.
They did call me the bird girl, yeah.
Birds would land in your hair randomly?
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah. Especially the ones that I'd let go. So because having baby birds and rescuing them, and also just sick and injured birds, because I'd put them in little socks and put them in my wardrobe, just because then they'd feel contained and they'd feel safe. And whenever I opened my wardrobe door, all these little mouths would come out and go, "Ma, feed me, feed me." But what would happen is those birds would then regress to being a baby under the mum in the nest, and they would imprint on me as the mother. So then when I'd let them go, they'd go. But whenever I went outside, they'd come back and they'd land in my hair, or if I was riding my bike down the street, sometimes they'd come and land on the handlebars and have a couple of birds fluttering around my head.
So still with the little Gina Chick, she was sad and lonely and she found some solace, not just a lot of solace in nature, birds and all sorts of animals, but she also found solace in books.
Absolutely. But I don't think I was like sad and lonely. Like that wasn't my experience. Yes, I experienced that that the kids at school were like an animal species, and I didn't know how to communicate with them. But I had all of nature to communicate. So yes, there was loneliness, but I wasn't sad. I mean, I was in love with life. I was, creative things. I was making music. I was running down to the beach. I was, hanging out with my sisters. But yes, you're right that one of the places that I found absolute connection was in books, and I became a voracious reader. I taught myself to read, I think, at about 4, and then didn't stop and haven't stopped since then, to the point where the characters in books felt like, and still do feel like, my friends.
Yeah, one of the things I think I wrote about in the story about you, and that is quite palpable in the book that you have written, We Are the Stars. Sounds like a promotion for you, doesn't it? But a lot of the characters from a lot of those early books were loners as well.
Yes.
Mowgli in the Jungle Book, and Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and Ayla in Clan of the Cave Bear. Was that kind of registering with you that, I can identify with these characters because they too are kind of living these maverick outlier lives?
Absolutely. I think we all come in with a story that's ours, and it's all, or we come in with the seeds of a story, and then we encounter that story on the outside. And these days it's probably through a film, or it's probably through a game or a Netflix series. But when I was growing up, it was through a book. And I think most people can track back to a time when they were maybe 6 or 7 or 8, where they read or they encountered a story that got inside them and rang them like a bell, that felt like it was them in some other form. And my experience is that when we get that, when our insides and our outsides meet, and that story that we have inside meets the story in some way externally, there's this ignition that happens, and that story inside us starts to grow. It starts to put down roots, and it starts to grow shoots and leaves, and becomes part of a navigation point for our lives. For me, the story of the outlier, the story of the misfit, the story of the lone wolf was so, I think, encoded into my DNA that when I would encounter that story in books, I felt such a kinship and a resonance with those characters. They became real. They became alive, as almost more alive than any of the kids at school. And they became my friends because I could understand them and they could understand me.
And you did a very curious thing, didn't you? You would tear a little corner of the page and you would chew it slowly. Hopefully you chewed it slowly.
Yeah.
And swallowed. You digested
absolutely
the page itself.
Yes.
And what were you doing by doing that? Were you trying to have the character inhabit you, or you inhabit the character?
I don't think it was as conscious as that, because it started when I was 6 years old with the first book that really kind of broke me open, which was The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. And I remember reading that book, and all of a sudden I wasn't reading. And I think I say it in the book, I wasn't reading, I was remembering something that my heart always knew. And whatever happened then, whatever alchemy that was, the jungle grew inside me and I grew inside it, and I became the story and it became me. And so those characters of Mowgli and Baloo and Bagheera and the monkeys and all of them, they were so alive, and I wanted to take them inside me. I never wanted to not be reading this story. And so I tore the corner of one of the pages to eat it because I wanted to consume it. I wanted it to be so inside me that it could never leave. And this started a habit that I still maintain to this day, where I am, and don't ever lend me your books because they might come back with little corners missing, because I eat the pages.
So you read Crime and Punishment and there's like 20 little corners of pages missing?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
But it depends on the book.
Depends on the book. Yeah, if the characters are alive for me and it stops being reading and I start to become the book and it becomes me, that's when I will catch myself and go, oh yeah, I'm chewing a bit of paper right now.
Okay, so this is your nursery, this is your cradle, this is the landscape of your heart and mind, as well before you went on this reality television show where the challenge is to survive longer than anybody else in nature. You had nature inside you.
Absolutely.
So did you have a kind of core confidence that you were going to win the season, the contest?
Oh, that's a big question. I think I knew that as long as I didn't injure myself and as long as I could keep my blood pressure up and not get medically extracted, I knew that I could outlast anyone. So, you know, life has other ideas. I wasn't sort of arrogant enough to say, yes, I'm going to win this. I also wasn't that geared on winning it. I wasn't thinking about winning when I was out there. I wasn't counting days. I wasn't thinking how many people were left. I was literally just dancing in the moss and singing to a platypus and, you know, going fishing and doing all the things. But I, you know, if I track back to when I first started applying, I would definitely say that I knew that if I didn't blow it, I could win.
Well, as soon as I saw you dancing in the moss and singing to the lake, I thought, she's going to win. And I think a lot of people thought that because there was an attunement to nature. And that's something that, again, you write about with great beauty and precision about the way in which nature speaks to us. And that we kind of can take our instructions from nature if we've opened the portals for that kind of conversation. And I guess that conversation has been alive in you for a long time, since you were a little girl.
Yeah, that conversation's been alive for me my whole life. And I think that probably I would say that that is actually our birthright. You know, we live in a culture where we get grown up in boxes. We get grown up in our, you know, there's 2 people or 3 people or 1 person and they live in a box. And then they might have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 little people also in that box. And then one person has to go from that box to another box to make the money to pay for the first box. And they don't actually own the box because there's a really big box that actually owns the box. And then the little people go off to, there's a series of boxes to learn how to live in the world of boxes. And the only things that get their needs met really are the boxes. And so that is what we're born into. But in our DNA, for 350,000 years, we've been Homo sapiens, and for 340,000 of those years, we were hunter-gatherers. So the vast majority of the information in our DNA is not from living in boxes. It's living in villages where we would be moving through the landscape and in deep connection with each other, with nature, with a spiritual life, and connection with the information that's coming from the landscape to get our needs met. And that is our birthright. And if you take a baby, they don't know that they're born in a modern time. Like, we are Stone Age humans who are born into this world. So we learn how to survive in the world of boxes by disconnecting from the greater wisdom. But the thing that I find is it actually doesn't take much to remember. And that's the conversation that I love having, is like like our birthright is to have that attunement to nature. And our whole organism is geared to have that attunement to nature. So once we are given that possibility, once those doors are open, once we're shown how, it actually doesn't take very long for those connections to start to be generated, and for that information that we are designed to receive from the greater natural world to start to come in.
Would it be a stretch to say that then nature starts talking back to you?
For me, yes. My experience is that. Now, that if you've never had that experience, that's going to sound pretty woo-woo and pretty hippy-dippy and all of those things. My experience from a lifetime of this level of receptivity and this level of connection is absolutely because nature is a web. In nature, nothing is more important than anything else. There is no hierarchy in nature. In nature, every life is as important as every other life, and everything exists in balance, and every strand of the web pulls on every other, and every action has consequences through the web. And so if anything in nature lives in a disconnected way, it's going to die. It's going to die. Whereas because we've managed to get ourselves this far along now, we've sort of lost that that connection. For us, that might not feel true. But for me, having lived this way, I absolutely experience that web, and that by being receptive, I can receive the information that's coming in that web. Now, we could say nature is talking to me, or we could say that I have receptivity enough to just receive vast amounts of information and data that are coming in a non-cognitive way, that are coming through at like my instinctive processes, and that is like a vital and fundamental function that humans have.
Indigenous people would say they've been doing that for 40,
Exactly.
50,000 years, wouldn't they?
80,000 years. Who knows how many thousand?
So
years.
you're out there in nature, but you're in a forbidding kind of corner of nature. And you're there 67 days. You're there 9 weeks and 4 days, and you probably could have gone on.
I was very annoyed when they pulled me out, I have to say. Anyway, go on.
Why were you annoyed?
Because they pulled me out.
So you
I
would have just...
was going for 90 days. So I went in there and I staked myself out at 90 days. And I kind of hung myself on that stake and said, all right, until 90 days, there is no option. I'm just here. And then I'll reevaluate at 90 days. And when they came to get me, I reckon I had about 3 weeks worth of food still.
What was the toughest part of that 67 days for you?
I guess that one of the toughest parts of that 67 days was wearing shoes. Yeah. Because of the nature of that landscape, it wasn't safe for me in a survival sense to be barefoot. There were drowned trees everywhere. There were snags. Everything was mud, and the moss that was on the mud would slide at any moment. So at any time I could go, over, I could fall, I could slide a foot into a snag that's underneath the mud and impale my foot. So I had to wear shoes. Plus it was sub-zero for some of the time, and I didn't want to get frostbite. So I wore shoes, and I had arguments about the kinds of shoes that I wanted to wear. And because from an occupational health and safety perspective, there was a certain quality of footwear that I was required to take, and that kind of footwear is not anything that I would normally wear. It's like having bricks on my feet. So I was miserable because I see with my feet. Like, my feet are all-terrain vehicles. I'm used to, walking on the ground and receiving information through my feet. So to have them encased in brick, my balance was off. I was falling over. They were cramping. I was really uncomfortable. And then I'd take them off finally and cry and apologise to my feet. And I reckon that was probably one of the hardest things.
There's a moment watching Alone where we all, as viewers, become aware that you had suffered an incomprehensible loss years earlier, and that was the loss of your beloved daughter, Blaze. Are you able to talk a little about that?
Sure.
I think it'd be fair to say we heard in your wailing for her, because you realised that particular night, and you'd conjured her that it would have been her 12th birthday, and you lost her in terrible circumstances. What happened?
My daughter Blaze died of cancer when she was just over 3 years old. She had a neuroblastoma, and that's a tumour of the nervous system. And it was really quick. Like, from the moment she was properly sick to when she was gone was very fast. It was 9 days. So, but there was a bit of a procedure before there, getting her diagnosed and discovering this. But then she was here, and then she was gone. And it's one of the things that I've spent the last 12 years. Yeah, is it 12 years? No, 11 years. I think it's 11 years. I don't even know. See, that's the thing. It's so long ago now. But I've spent the last 11 years dealing with that loss and dealing with that grief. And I think I have a fairly unusual attitude to grief. I tend to ask what loss and what grief demands of me. Like, what is it asking of me? And then whatever it's asking of me, I do it, because grief demands to be felt. And by saying yes to all the little griefs, I feel like we are training ourselves and preparing ourselves for the big one, for our own deaths and the big deaths around us. But again, because we have sort of strayed so far from First Nations wisdom, where there are technologies and social technologies and ceremonies and rituals for people who are grieving that are designed to support them so that they can metabolize that pain. Our culture, I think, has lost so much of that. So a lot of people won't feel grief. It's just, we'll just go numb, or we'll distract ourselves, or we'll just get angry. And all of those things are, I think, a natural part of grief as well. But for me, it was important to let the grief move. And so part of that is dancing, is to actually move it out of my body. In a way, Blaze leaving has been a huge gift. I say that having her was the greatest gift of my life, and losing her was the second greatest gift of my life, because without her and in the journey of losing her, I am bigger and I'm brighter and I'm wiser and I have more compassion and more wisdom and more capacity and more kindness. And I can dance with life knowing there's nothing I can't be with. And there's something about having that ground as well. So yes, I've lost my daughter, and yes, it's the hardest thing. It is the hardest thing and not something I'd wish on any parent. But also it has been an incredible gift. And actually this book is part of that gift. I feel like it's the last part of her gift flying out into the world.
Well, thank you for sort of being so candid and articulate about that, because there's a community, there's a special community out there. Anyone who's lost a child belongs to that community.
Yeah.
And I think your words hopefully will resonate with them. But I just want to go back to your childhood, if I may, because there was this extraordinary, rebellious, singular spirit in you. You were a strangeling, as you've described yourself. And this is something you shared with the grandmother you never knew. Tell us about this grandmother.
My mum is adopted, and when we were growing up, we used to fantasize about her mother, our mysterious grandmother being someone famous. And we'd say, Mum, she's a famous ballerina because Mum had these amazing legs. Or Mum, she's a famous opera singer because Mum had this voice. Or she's a Russian princess because Mum had this cheekbone and this mouth. And then when I was about 21, Mum rode away to find out who her birth mother was, because the adoption laws had changed. And when the birth certificate came back, there was a name on it that she recognised, and that was the name Charmian Clift. And I didn't know who Charmian Clift was, but Mum did. And Charmian Clift was this incredible writer who has become part of, Australian sort of literary royalty in a way. And she was, the myth maybe, or I don't know if it's true, is the story is that she was the first female columnist in Australia. She was an incredible essayist. She went to the Greek islands with George Johnston, who she married, and they had Leonard Cohen there for the first 2 years that he was in the islands, and this wild expat community of bohemians who'd be drinking and carousing and creating. And my mother was the illegitimate first child of Charmian, which was a huge surprise to her and to the Australian literary community at large.
And your mother, Suzanne, wrote a book.
She wrote a book called Searching for Charmian about her journey. And that book went bestseller in Australia 30 years ago now. And because Mum became a poster child for adoption, because she'd just gone through this huge thing at a time when adoption stories were starting to, filter out into the greater world, the greater Australian landscape, because the adoption laws had changed. And here was this amazing story of my mother finding this incredible mother, who was kind of like every adopted kid's fantasy to have a famous mother.
And when you discovered that this was your grandmother, you said to yourself, and you write this, well, that explains everything then.
Mm-hmm.
What did it explain?
I'd been bullied quite a lot, especially in primary school, but, in the early days of high school as well. And one of the things that I got told often is, you're too big. You're too big. You're too much. You're too loud. You're too everything. And so I'd internalized this story that I was too big. And then to discover that my grandmother was this incredible trailblazing figure, I felt like I understood where that bigness, that size came from. And it made it okay.
So you went looking for her in a way, didn't you? I mean, I went looking for your grandmother and her husband on Hydra and Leonard Cohen because that had insinuated itself into my imagination growing up. That was like burnished into this kind of bohemian salon that your grandmother and George Johnson were kind of the leading figures for, and into whose embrace Leonard kind of wandered in 1960 when he arrived on Hydra. Did you go looking for your grandmother in Hydra? Did you want to sort of try and retrace something of her in the Greek islands?
I did eventually. But the interesting thing is when we found out that Charmian was my mother's mother, was my grandmother, I didn't really go looking for her at all because that was Mum's story. I was really happy that Mum had found her mother, and it meant so much to my mum. And it wasn't until after I got out from Alone and I ended up recovering from that in the Greek islands. I spent a week on Hydra and went looking for Charmian for the first time in my life. I thought, while I'm here, I want to find Charmian. And because I'd heard so much about her from my mother and I'd seen the pictures and the paintings and heard Mum's stories and read Mum's book, I was looking for her in the sponge divers. I was looking for her in the black robed priests. I was looking for her in the cobblestones and the donkeys, and all I found was really tourists and high-end fashion shops and very expensive yachts with, spitting out tourists, and I couldn't find Charmian anywhere. And I tracked down her house and found the house. And my mum had been in that house as well and had a really beautiful story about it. And so I had this fantasy that I was going to go to the house and I was going to knock on the door and someone would open it and they would recognise me because of the cheekbones and the lips and the whole, Charmian vibe. And they'd let me in and I'd get to wander around inside and see it. And I had this whole fantasy in my head, and I went up and found the house. And I didn't feel anything at the house. Knocked on the door. Nothing. Empty. It felt derelict, actually. And I sat around and thought, I think I had about 2 hours to go before my ferry was going to leave. And I wandered down this little pathway.
I know exactly the pathway.
Yeah, and I came across this taverna. And this taverna has these trees that I've painted white. There's a very famous series of photos of Charmian and Leonard Cohen from Life magazine in the early 60s. And Leonard Cohen's playing the guitar and Charmian's leaning on his shoulder, and it's just one of those iconic photos. So when I've seen this taverna, I've realised that these are the trees. This is Charmian's taverna, and I may not have felt her at all in the house, but as soon as I saw those trees, I burst into tears, and I was just like, Mom, like losing it. And the taverna wasn't open yet, and all the staff came out. They're used to Leonard Cohen acolytes finding the place now. But as soon as I said Charmian's name, I said, Charmian was my grandmother. They all, like their eyes widened, they all stepped back and they said, here, have the tree, have the tree. So I sat on that tree and I played the guitar and I cried and I sang, and I felt for the very first time in my life, I've really felt the presence of not only my grandmother, but also my daughter, so by my ghosts, and I felt like my ghosts were dancing together. And in a way, I was the living matrix through which they were stitched as they sort of danced around in the Greek taverna.
Did you ever make contact with Leonard Cohen when he was in Australia?
No, I didn't. I'm so annoyed with myself. I am so annoyed with myself. I have a great friend who used to go to all the concerts, and I kept on thinking I should go and just, say hi. Never did. And now it's one of the biggest facepalm moments of my life. Like, don't.
Because he had credited your grandmother and George Johnson with having helped him to become the writer.
Oh, I know. I don't even know why I didn't. Honestly, it's just one of those absolute brain fart moments.
because you hadn't actually claimed Charmian as your grandmother yet?
Probably. I hadn't claimed Charmian. So Leonard was, he was an amazing figure, but I hadn't really taken him for myself at that point.
Charmian, as we know, famously killed herself in 1969, and the same year you were born. And you yourself contemplated something that dark when you were around 30. Mm-hmm. What had brought you so low, and what do you think saved you?
I think in every life there is going to come a dark night of the soul. And for me, what that means is our unconsciousness and the choices that we make take us to a place where those consequences create a life that isn't sustainable for us in its current form. And we have a choice in that moment to grow up or to not. My dark night of the soul was falling in love with a con man when I was, I think, 27, 28. And by the time I got to be 30, the consequences of that choice and everything that came from that were that I was horrifically in debt with no way of paying it off. And there was a moment when I faced that. I faced those consequences and started to take responsibility for them. And what that meant was that I had to pay off a lot of money with, as a young woman, and it meant that I was working like from 6 a.m. till 11 o'clock at night, 6 days a week in beautiful drudgery. And I think by the time it was Y2K, so it was when the year 2000 clicked over and then the world didn't end, a part of me just saw this grey tunnel to forever and thought, I'm actually done. If one more thing goes wrong, I'm out of here. And then for 9 months, that one more thing didn't go wrong, which I find extraordinary, because when do you ever have 9 months where nothing goes wrong? I was ready. I was like, okay, that's it. Made a pact, one more thing. And then it's not like there was any great magic of like, oh, here's the thing I need to live for. I just one day realised that I wanted to be alive and then started to crawl back up the incredibly deep pit that I had thrown myself into with my choices. And what saved me was that I rescued myself. I used my intuition, I used my skill, I gathered wisdom. Like grain by grain, I gathered wisdom and I created for myself from those grains, those tiny little grains of sand, I created a landscape which is mine and I can rely on and I know in my bones. And from there, I have built a life, and I have built a life that works, and I've built a life where I take responsibility for my actions. And it meant that even though I have lost a child, it was harder. The dark night of the soul with the con man was harder. I was fighting it, and I was lying to myself, and I was lying to other people, and I was not a good human. And so that was truly suffering, whereas losing Blaze was pain, but clean pain. Like it was a clean cut and it healed clean.
And look at you now. I mean, you've won the Alone Australia series. You're a meditation teacher. You're a dance instructor, a meditation dance instructor. You take wilderness retreats and show people how to survive in the wild. You've become the co-host of Great Australian Walks on SBS. You're a podcast host yourself. You're now the author of an extraordinary memoir. One of the lines that I absolutely love in your book, and I took it for the end of the story, which was that as a child you spent a lot of time wondering how to leave your strangeness behind. But as it turns out, that was the wisest part of you. For all those people out there who are listening to this and think, there are all these strange parts of me, what do you say to them about that strangeness being the wisest part of you?
I would say to anyone who feels like they're an outsider or a weirdo or a weirdling or a strangeling, that is your beauty and that is your gift and that is what makes you you. And to be in a world that tells us that we're not okay exactly as we are, that is a miserable place to be. But when we get out into nature, we can see that, like, is a tree ever the wrong shape? Does a cloud ever go the wrong way? A tree is the shape of a tree, and every tree is different, and a cloud is the shape of a cloud, and every cloud is different. And we're no different to that. It's only when we start to allow the opinions of a greater world and the judgments of a greater world to affect us, that's when we tell ourselves we're strange or weird. But really, if there is beauty in every single shape, and whatever your weirdness is, then that is the most magnificent part of you.
Thank you, Gina Chick. Lovely talking to you.
Thanks, David. Always a pleasure.
That was David Lacer interviewing Alone TV star Gina Chick for another great episode of Good Weekend Talks. Tune in every week for more compelling conversations. Coming soon, we chat with Australian actor, writer and disability advocate Hannah Deviney. Good Weekend Talks is brought to you by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Subscriptions power our newsrooms. To support independent journalism, search Subscribe Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, rate and comment wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of Good Weekend Talks is produced by Chi Wong. Editing from Conrad Marshall. Tom McKendrick is head of audio. And Katrina Strickland is the editor of Good Weekend.